All right, welcome to the second installment of Book Talk with Jordan and Stefan. I am joined, as always, by my co-host Stefan Di Iorio. We are here today to discuss Cards on the Table by Agatha Christie, one of her iconic Hercule Poirot mysteries. The name Agatha Christie, if I may venture an analogy, is to mystery writing as Shigeru Miyamoto is to video game design. The name is inextricably linked with the genre. She has countless imitators, countless fans, and her work endures even to the modern age, and if her promotional copy is to be believed, she is the best-selling novelist of all time, outsold only by the Bible and Shakespeare. Cards on the Table is one of the middle period Hercule Poirot mysteries. It deals heavily with murder surrounding a game of bridge. And beyond that, this was Stefan's selection for Book Talk, so I'm going to let him intro the novel and talk a little bit about it. Stefan?
Hey, thank you. Before we begin, I'm just going to correct some bit of trivia there. I'm sure it was probably she was the most sold book at the time. I think since then, I think Tolkien has surpassed her, and really her only book that has really made a dent in that top 100 list of most books sold, I think, was called "And Then There Were None," and that's an outside of her Poirot mysteries. She's wrote about 5 or 6 series, and that one was completely independent. So she has come across crime in her own style on so many angles and so many levels. The reason why I decided to choose this book is I would look at it as what Christie does in general. She has a piece of just about everything in almost all of her books in this book. This is actually the first instance where we see Ariadne Oliver, which is literally a writer on board moment. So she puts herself into this book, and she complains about writing and all her readers and what they complain about. She complains about Poirot through him. So it's the start of her finally saying, okay, I'm going to go back to what I enjoy doing and finish this story off and finish this series off and then go back to various other mysteries she had in her head. Now, this story, as I said, was typical, has a rich guy, very eccentric. It has a series of sleuths, it has a series of potential murderers. It happens during a bridge game. And she even has a foreword at the start of this book saying, don't worry about evidence, don't worry about this or that, just focus on the psychology of what's going on. And these sort of hints, as generic as they are very key to understanding Christie. And her stories are not they're not grandiose. Her prose is somewhat lackluster. It's nothing special. Her characterization is very shallow. It has to be a quick story. It's novella format. So you sort of have to get along with that. So Poirot is going to be indomitable. He's going to be this perfect guy who's going to always be true and just. He's never going to sway from that. And we see a lot of that in this book. We see Poirot just constantly fighting to see what he knows is right, because he can never be wrong, as he likes to remind people. And this is probably the best instance of him proving that to others, how he can never be wrong. And I'm not going to spoil anything, of course, because that would be rude. But I thought that was the climax of the story for me, when he proves himself despite the obvious.
Well, this is interesting that you bring this up because I had been reading this book and had been asking myself why you had chosen this one. Because, obviously the most famous, well-known Poirot mystery is Murder on the Orient Express. I was not as familiar with Poirot or with Christie in general. I had seen And Then There Were None performed as a play many years ago, and then I knew her cultural impact and that sort of thing. As William Dietrich puts it on the jacket copy on Cards on the Table, when you think it's Colonel Mustard in the basement with the wrench, you owe the fun to Dame Christie. And he's right. I mean, she established that whole atmosphere of kind of drawing room mysteries, and This is interesting because I actually did not read the foreword when I read the book. I went straight to the story itself, and this fills in a gap for me because one of the things that was unsatisfying about this story, and Stefan, you know what I'm referring to. I'm not going to give it away for the audience, but towards the end of the story, when Poirot puts it all together, he comes to the table, no pun intended, with information that was not presented to the reader, that he himself has discovered off camera, if you will, and comes into the environment having that information. And that was a little unsatisfying for me because I felt like, if you read, Sherlock Holmes is the ultimate mystery detective character, and the way those stories are written, the Holmes mysteries are written, you are given everything that Holmes is given to solve the mystery. If you read a story like The League of Red-Headed Men, for example, you will find that it presents all of the information that Holmes needs to solve the mystery, so you can try to solve it yourself as you're getting to it and be wrong or be pleasantly surprised, that kind of thing. So up until the last two chapters, I was barreling along with Poirot, putting the pieces together, and then suddenly he comes in with information that other people, or that we, the audience, would not have been given. But as you say that this is about the psychology of the characters, I think that really makes everything fall into place. And I noticed as well, Miss Oliver, I thought, and I always love when, a lot of people will, a lot of readers will say that it's pretentious or haughty of authors to inject themselves into their stories with avatars like Miss Oliver, but Harlan Ellison did it with Cordwainer Bird, Kurt Vonnegut did it with Kilgore Trout, and ultimately, I think it's a great opportunity for the author to kind of ruminate on their own flaws as a writer, their own frustrations, kind of convey those frustrations. And I think we can see in Miss Oliver Christie's aggravation with the mystery genre. And ultimately, I think you're correct that you have to evaluate this very much from the psychology of the characters, because this is a story that is structured deeply around the strategy and the playing of the card game bridge. And indeed, as we mentioned earlier, it is about a murder which occurs while a game of bridge is going on. And so Poirot's, and obviously one of the players is the killer. So as Poirot analyzes the bridge scores, goes over the game, he learns so much about the psychology of the characters and about their motives and their behavioral tendencies. And that was fascinating to me. But like I said, even so, that one last little scene at the end where it brings in new information that the rest of us didn't already have to justify the conclusion, it felt like that sort of thing would have worked if this was a Alfred Hitchcock Presents episode where, we have a protagonist that's maybe trying to get away with a murder or something, and we're in his shoes, and he thinks he's gotten away, and then, oh no, here's this last little, loose end that you forgot to tie up. It would have worked in that context. I don't think it worked here. So that was my frustration with the story.
I'm certainly going to have to talk to you about that after we finish filming, because I don't want to reveal anything. But the idea of having unrevealed knowledge, this is actually a classic problem with the Sherlock Holmes stories. And it's even found in the study in Scarlet, where you have Sherlock who has this knowledge of the time period that obviously the average reader wouldn't have. And he already knows what's happened, even though we've been told all the clues. So it's really a lack of understanding of that time period. But there's no other way we would even go through that line of reasoning if we didn't know about the certain tires a taxi would use that as a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage at the time, and how that would impact the snow. And by the time he's barely in the door, he's already figured it out. He just tells us that at the end of his story. So when we talk about unrevealed knowledge, I can't recall in a Christie story where it's based on evidence. Everything is always about the personality or the character of the potential murderer. So I'm going to have to go through that story one more time just to see what you're talking about. In regards to the writer on board moment, you're correct. I'd say this is probably the best example I've seen personally of this, because Ariadne Oliver's in 6 other stories. And the second one after this is called Lord Edgware Dies, where she literally, this is completely by chance that Ariadne and Poirot are in the same location. She throws an apple at him, hits him on the head. Poirot's like freaking out. What the heck was that? She stops her car. She gets out. She says, "Oh, I'm sorry, Hey, it's Poirot. What do you know?" And she's actually referencing the previous. She's actually referencing Cards on the Table about this crazy thing that just happened. And you're like, okay. So there must have been some sort of animosity that Miss Agatha Christie was having with her fans and with Poirot, because everyone loved Poirot. Ever the fans would always be pointing out problems, and that was kind of the joke she was trying to express, saying, I know I made mistakes. I know this poison doesn't smell like almonds. I know this, all these things. So to see that, I thought was a really cute moment for a writer to be as prolific as she is. Just put that in there. It's like, just get these books out the door.
Well, I think you're right about that, and that was. As I researched, again, not being as aware of Agatha Christie or as in depth with Agatha Christie as you are, I went and did a little research, and that was true that she was tired of writing by the middle of the series. She was tired of writing Poirot, and she wanted to move on, but it was what the readers wanted. So to use the British slang, if you will, it was having herself be in the story was kind of 2 fingers in the air to all of the fans that she was frustrated with accommodating. And I think she does it beautifully, because she certainly is wonderfully self-aware, and it actually makes the story, I think, a little more enjoyable, because you're kind of, in any genre fiction like this, whether it's mystery, romance, what have you, anything like that, you're always going to be on the lookout for like the stereotypes of the genre and everything. And so you've got someone here that's kind of rolling her eyes at those with you as well, and that makes it a little more palatable that way. But what was most interesting, or one thing that's interesting to me about these characters, these iconic mystery characters, these iconic detectives like Poirot, like Sherlock Holmes, like Nero Wolfe, and that kind of thing, is we very seldom see them directly from their own vantage. Having the character themselves narrate, the detective themselves narrate the story, seems really more like something that came along in the age of noir and film noir and modern detective writing of Philip Roth and Raymond Chandler, all that kind of stuff, and having them be the direct focal point. But this, what I notice is, and I know there are modern examples of this, but it's always there are 2 ways that we see these characters. Either we see them from the vantage of an assistant, a nearby assistant who narrates everything, and that's Watson with Holmes, that's Nero Wolfe, and all of that. Or we see them from the vantage, or we see them in contrast to more incompetent primary characters. And the great example of that in this is that we have Battle, who's the actual police officer conducting a good investigation, but not really knowing how to get anywhere with it. Kind of always coming up dry because he's following basic procedural methods and doesn't know how to analyze like Poirot does. And so it becomes it becomes this kind of ongoing contrast, and we see that even with modern detective characters. One great example of that is Inspector Gadget, the children's cartoon, where Gadget is this bumbling doofus, and his niece Penny is the one who actually figures out what's going on in all of them. And so it's interesting to me that Poirot is presented in that way, and that detective characters are very often presented in that way. Even in modern times, we have House, House MD with Hugh Laurie, which is a medical detective show, and in that one you have all of his team of assistants who try everything they can and come up dry, and then House comes in and diagnoses brilliantly. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that exists as a literary device? And why do you think Christie chooses to present Poirot that way?
A lot of things in the genre involve the assistant. I mean, Poirot has actually several assistants, but it's not really talked about too often in the stories, especially the TV series. He has Miss Lemon, who is this insane secretary. She organizes everything on a ridiculous level. Hastings, of course, is the straightest guy. Like, he is the straight man to a comedy routine, I guess, which is kind of the same idea, only instead of comedy, it's ingenious deduction. I don't know how to characterize that comparison, but it's something that brings the reader down, because the inner workings of Poirot, even in other stories, he refers to Poirot as Poirot. Like Poirot refers to this in the third person because he believes that he is this other being that is able to do these amazing things, this wizard that can take apart reality. So we need something solid to fall back on. Now, in the case of Poirot, as well as Nero Wolfe has Archie Goodwin. They're kind of old, they're kind of big, and they're almost armchair detectives, whereas Nero Wolfe was entirely an armchair detective. And he can't get up. He doesn't move around. He's always very focused. He's very eccentric. He's very particular. So Archie Goodwin does all his legwork. There's even scenes in almost all of the Agatha Christie Poirot books where you'll see Hastings talk to one of the inspectors they're with and say, you know what, the inspector's doing all the work. They're getting all the evidence. You should go do that. And there's actually an purely armchair detective story with Poirot, where he predicts what happened, where the evidence is, and where to find. Like he just figures it out. So he's saying, no. Don't worry about all this evidence. It's purely mental. That is where the best detective work takes place. And once you begin to understand that about Christie, your conceptions about how to look at her work as a detective fiction is a lot different, is a lot simpler. Because when we think of detective fiction, we think of Sherlock. We think of the guy who could find meaning in a hair fiber and a fingerprint and a ashtray and whatnot. Poirot doesn't do that. There are times when he does find data and he gets his little magnifying glass. There are times, but it's always revealed to the audience very early. So it's sort of a base to bring our heads down, because these guys, literary in terms of character, I think I said he was a wizard. He is literally a Deus Ex Machina device that reveals things, that slowly doesn't do it all at the ending, although you could argue they do, but he's sort of opening the door, saying, "Hey, look over here. There's a little clue you might like." With Poirot, it's usually all at the ending. I think there's only one story I can reference where he actually, once he gets clues, he then shows them to you, and that's Lord Edgware Dies, where he'll get clues from the detective as well as Hastings, and he'll say, no, Hastings, this is how it is done. And he explains to you. So if you really want a step-by-step process, that is a very different Agatha Christie story. But other ones, he has no one. He has absolutely no one helping him. And there's one with Ariadne Oliver. She's just berating him the entire time, and he goes home empty. It's literally like the 9th chapter of the book, and he's just like, I have no clue. And the reader has no clue. So if everyone has no clue, and we have no straight guy to get him going, I was really pissed off with that story until the last chapter. And then he comes back to the crime scene and he figures it out.
All right. Okay. Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I think you've definitely increased my appreciation for this story and for Agatha Christie in general. One of the things that was fascinating to me as we talk about this is I was keenly aware of how Poirot goes out of his way in an almost unnerving manner to provoke responses from people. He is keenly aware of how to elicit behavioral responses from people and kind of suss out their likely modes of behavior and all of that. And yeah, and I was wondering, did you ever feel like reading about his methods that maybe his methods become ethically questionable, ethically dubious at times, or do you feel like he's always on the up and up?
It's hard to say because there are times where he knows something bad is going to happen, but he knows it's after the fact that he's proven what's going on, or he has elicited a response from the murderer to behave and commit and confess, because Christie is very clear on how murderers should behave and whatnot, and that's one of the problems with the believability at that climax of the stories, of all the stories really, because he has zero evidence. He has no evidence. He has no idea how he's going to prove this in court. So they have to get that. He has to get that confession, and if it's not a confession, he knows that something really bad is going to happen. They're going to commit a suicide, or they're going to commit a double suicide. And he says, bon, because he knows it's about to happen. He's not stupid. He knows the personality of every nuance of these people. So, they get everyone's clothing clean. What's the word? They go through all their dirty laundry. So everyone knows everyone else at that point in time, who's done what. And only he knows what's going to happen next. So yeah, there are times where he does break and enter. There are times when he lies all the time, but he does it for the bon Dieu, for the greater good of God and whatnot. There are some religious aspects to him. It's very subtle. It's not really shown in a strong way. I think there's only one part of one of the stories where he makes a sign of the cross. So he is religious, but it's very, very subtle. So he believes that he has been put on this earth to do God's grace of bringing people to justice. So there is a little bit of retribution, and he never, I wouldn't say he never commits murder or other such heinous acts, but he's aware of what's going. He's very, very aware of what's going on, and that's why he takes it so seriously. In regards to this sort of understanding of the murderer's persona, though, Christie is very clear. And if you want a certain clue into all of her stories, it's really simple. She actually lays it out. The more you read, Poirot will tell a little anecdote saying, okay, the most likely candidate is probably the murderer. I'd say that's 60 to 80% of the time, because she's very clever and she'll make you think. But if you got a butler who has access to all the rooms and knows everyone's whereabouts, there's a good candidate. The reason why the murderer or the murdered person was killed was based upon their character. So there was some reason why the murderer wanted to kill that person, and it wasn't just money. It's probably something to do that made them want to do it. So you have to focus. That's why I always go back to the victim and ask about what kind of person was he? How did you know him? Did you love him? Did you hate him? Da, da, da. The other one's kind of obscure. In some cases, the victim is not extraordinary. And in that case, the murderer has to be extraordinary. So what that means is that the murderer is so ingenious and clever and thinks he's amazing that he heard something about what someone was going to do to him or was going to reveal about him because he has a dark past. So that person was eliminated, and then framed and used all that knowledge of that person to frame someone else because they thought they could get away with it. So there's always that it's either a singular person who's the most likely candidate, or the victim itself was so extraordinary that you need extraordinary circumstances. And everything else is just Sherlock. Sherlock is known for eliminating all the possibilities. Poirot is actually doing his job, going step by step, even though he already knows he has a 90% chance he knows what's what. He still has to go into everyone's background. He still has to interview them, their friends and family, and all these obscure facts just to be 100% sure. So that's the one thing the detectives, they do the first step of that, but they don't know how to continue, and Poirot finishes the job.
Super. So I think there is definitely this left brain, right brain approach between Poirot and the other detectives. And I think that gives me a lot more perspective on what's happening. And you're right about him eliciting those behavioral responses because it's funny. I found myself genuinely, even though I'm not meant to empathize with any of these characters, the suspects, I found myself genuinely empathizing with them on that with that sense of desperation and that sense of unease because he is so good at bringing that out in people and bringing out the desperation that's going to make him go, okay, you got me, I did it, you see, and so that sense that you're being manipulated that way, and that was what was uh, rather uncomfortable to me. So one dimension of this that we wanted to talk about was the BBC television drama version of not just this, but all of the Poirot mysteries. Now, you had referred me to the episode and the adaptation of Cards on the Table, and I watched only a few minutes of it because I wanted to just get a feel for the production and that sort of thing. But what I found very quickly was that outside of the portrayal of Poirot, which I thought was spot on, the rest of it I felt was very it was not the world that I envisioned, and that's very often the case with book to screen adaptations. It's kind of like I like to say that when the first Harry Potter movie came out, Harry Potter in my mind became Daniel Radcliffe, and Emma Watson became Hermione, and all of that, and so those were my mental images, and I didn't want my vision of the world to be conflicted. But you had watched the whole episode and you had some thoughts about the similarities and the differences. I wanted you to elaborate on those.
Well, the first thing I thought was rather clever, or at least I thought was clever to me, they chose Alexander Siddig, who was Julian Bashir on Deep Space Nine, to play this Mountebank. What's his name? I'm trying to remember his name now. Shaitana, and this is a story where there's only a few other stories where Poirot notices a man with almost as a luxurious mustache as he has, and he looks at him. He goes, "My God, that is magnificent." And he's like, "No, no, no, it is not as good as mine." And it makes him pause for a moment. And the wonderful thing about Alexander Siddig, even after he talks about Deep Space Nine when it's over and they do the interviews. He says he was chosen as a blank slate, and they also chose him because they weren't too sure what his ethnicity was. And it's the same with Shaitana. Ariadne has a moment where she doesn't know what his background was. Is he Syrian? Is he Arabian? Is he this or that? So they got the right casting for the guy. They got the right actor. They added some stuff which I'm going to go through. But the character actors are there, and that's primarily what this is. This is a whole bunch of not leading men and women doing this hero's journey. These are specifically nuanced characters, and they're very plain and simple, and you can tell that very quickly. So you need that visual, and they got that right. So the show adaptation was, I'd say, the most controversial because of all the changes they made, even to the plot, which actually was not bad, but there are some which really made it really bad. So it's you sort of sit there and go, there was no need for this to happen, but they really wanted to do it. As you know, in the book, there's Superintendent Battle, for example, right? Well, he's in another story they had. So he was replaced by Superintendent Wheeler. And Battle is a known story. He's a known guy. He's in 5 other stories, but not in a Poirot mystery. So she wrote Superintendent Battle in his own books. So there was no reason to replace him. Like they were never going to use this actor again. So the main reason why they did that, I think, is to increase the number of suspects. For that, they've added clues. For example, a drug to drink. So they wanted you to look at evidence, but we all know that this is not an evidence-based story. So they sort of take away from what Agatha is. There's some shady past. They add background information, which they shouldn't really be doing with that character. So again, it's adding confusion, which you don't really. It was such a neat story in the book with the suspects. They didn't have to add a fifth. So that was a little off-putting. They replaced Colonel Race with Colonel Hughes. And the only reason was that because they used the actor previously, and he was also in the story. And it was just casting. It's no big deal. But what they did do with Shaitana is they gave him the hobby of photography. And that's obviously a very visual media and makes perfect sense, but it adds more depth to this guy who you don't need it to. So it adds to the confusion, which you don't do in a movie sort of scenario. You have to be quick, you have to be faster than a short story. There's an additional crime. It's not a murder. It's like a break-in, but it just overcomplicates things even more. So again, things keep piling up, and you're not even in the first 10 minutes. It's like, what the devil is going on in this thing? But the one thing I will reveal, which is not a plot reveal, even though it relates to the plot, is they brought up the concept of homosexuality. And homosexuality in the 30s was, I think, looked down upon, especially in Great Britain. And this is addressed to about 2 to 3 suspects, or 2 to 3 characters. And it's not over the top blatant. It's very just one moment here, one moment there. But they make it something that has to be covered up. So it kind of adds to the motive, if there wasn't enough one already, just to imply, oh, this is why the murderer did it. It didn't have to. So they wanted to add their own spin, and they made things even more complicated, which, again, this story was complicated enough for that to happen. The second murder in the book is actually just totally removed. They got rid of it. Usually in Agatha Christie stories, there's a murder, and then there's a second murder to cover up the first. And in this case, that never happened. So it's a little off-putting, and I would say it's a break from form, and they didn't really do it for any good reason. It could have still happened, but they decided not to. Let's see, what else was there? The third murder in the book is actually swapped, meaning the victim becomes the murdered, and the murderer becomes the victim. And that was, again, another unnecessary point of confusion. And I think it messed up that arc with one of the suspects because that happened. All these things, if someone were to tell this to me and I never saw it, I would immediately want to go out and see this thing because they've changed the story so much. It's well, as you know, any book to movie or TV translation is going to be different. And for me to see this, I was like, wow, this is great cinematography. Wait a second, this is not the right characterization. This is not the right character. So they actually do create new characters in the process. And one of the major ones was they revealed that one character is the family of another. They're related. And you're like, okay, why didn't you just do that halfway through the story? It's one of those unwritten rules. I know if you read the 20 rules for writing detective stories by S.S. Van Dyne, he wrote this back in the 20s or whatever. At the 20th one is just a bullet point list of just things you do not do. And this isn't there, but this should totally be added. If you suddenly reveal the family members related to the other victim or the other possible murderer, you're like, it changes a lot. And for that to be revealed is just, I would say that's something you do not step on. And then, of course, the motivation of the victim has changed. Why Shaitana was killed, why he threw the party. It's sort of, it adds to the character again. That's not a bad thing, but it increases complexity where it shouldn't have to be. So it actually does cover up a plot hole, which I'm not against. So I do like that. But they had to do 5 other things, which I've just listed, to get to that point. And it was like, you didn't really have to do that. They could have just cut it out, it would have been fine. But nope, they had to add it. So those sorts of things really gnaw at me because they take lots of liberties in translations. And because this is one of the medium to ending books, I thought they would have gotten it figured out by now, but they decided to change it. They also changed Murder on the Orient Express, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with. and the motivations of Poirot at the end, which made everyone go, "Whoa, that was Poirot, really?" So yeah, those little moments sort of got to me. But other than that, I'm sure if you don't want to read the book, that will be a nice little taste of what Agatha Christie can do and what the BBC can publish within a 24-year lifespan.
Great, great. So as we come to the end of the program, the question we always pose is, would you recommend this book to our listeners? I would recommend it. However, I would say that I think, and I would imagine you'll agree with me, that a probably greater appreciation of the character and of Christie's writing would be to begin with the very beginning of the Hercule Poirot mysteries, which, even though they're not necessarily, they can be essentially read in most any order, I think. They're very anthology-based, but I think it probably would enhance the appreciation to begin from the very first book, which was The Mysterious Affair at Styles, and carry it all the way through to Curtin, Poirot's last case, and I think that would probably be the best image. What do you think?
Well, the reason why I chose, I had various reasons for choosing this one. It was for people who love reading or love murder mysteries and didn't know too much about Agatha Christie. You get a little bit of everything in this book. If you've never touched Agatha Christie, or you haven't really touched murder mysteries, and you want to read an Agatha Christie book, I totally recommend Peril at End House. I would say it's the best for newcomers to the genre. There's evidence, there's objects that Poirot discovers. It's very early on. It's charming. It happens on a seaside resort. There's all kinds of characters involved. There's Hastings. There's Miss Lemon. So it's a lot more traditional. I wouldn't say it's as lighthearted. Obviously, someone dies, so you can't say murder is lighthearted, but it's very British. So I think it'll be one of the wonderful things. If you want a more dramatic story, I would say Sad Cypress. If you want the dramatic arc in there, there's definitely one in there. It has a theme. It's definitely for a writer too, so it's a little more complicated. Ones to avoid. Evil Under the Sun. That is so complicated. What she does in 3 of her books, she lists evidence right before the final chapter. So if you haven't figured out what each of these pieces of evidence do, you're not going to get it. You're gonna screw it up. So there's things like that. Dead Man's Folly. Again, Poirot is totally lost the entire way through until the end. So are you. Yeah, but definitely Peril at End House. I think Mystery of the Blue Train was a beautiful story. There's just something about the European feel that Agatha loved about trains and traveling. An ingenious one is ABC Murders. That's very famous as well. And Five Little Pigs, which is kind of like if you want to see a really good dramatic cinematographic show where the BBC took lots of money and made a great thing, Five Little Pigs. That is probably the most beautifully done Poirot mystery on the BBC. Next to Sad Cypress. They actually did a really good Sad Cypress story as well. So yeah, great stuff.
Excellent. Very cool. Okay. So wrapping it up, we thank everybody for tuning in as always. If you enjoyed Book Talk, we hope that you will reach out with a donation at patreon.com/JordanOwen42. We want to make this channel into a great hub of libertarian pop culture analysis. And so thank you, as always, for listening. And for myself and Stefan, we look forward to seeing you back here next time on Book Talk, when our book will be Vulcan's Hammer by Philip K. Dick. So have a good rest of your day, and thank you for tuning in.